Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Profiles in Jewish History series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right back in with our first series, the Rabbis of the Talmud, and our second installment, which is Rebbi Akiva. So first off, I just want to start by wishing a mazel tov to everybody because I became a grandfather last night. My daughter gave birth to a beautiful baby boy in Eretz Yisrael, and we should only join together in Simchas and Klal Yisrael. Because of this, there will not be a lecture next week because I will be traveling back from the bris, God willing, and therefore we will be together 2 weeks from tonight once again with our subsequent lecture. But anyways, tonight we're discussing Rebbi Akiva. And Rebbi Akiva, there's really a love affair between the Jewish people and Rebbi Akiva, probably more so than any other rabbi of the Talmud. Everything about his life is the Jewish experience. He had numerous challenges that he always got up from and fought on. He was the ultimate optimist. He never gave up. And in so doing, he really represents in many ways the Jewish Superman. And that's why I think we all have a certain love affair with Rebbi Akiva, and if we don't already, we will after tonight's lecture. So, Rebbi Akiva, or as he's known throughout the Talmud, Akiva ben Yosef, was born around the year 20 of the Common Era, roughly 50 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. We know by his name, Akiva ben Yosef, that his father's name was Yosef, and his father was either a convert himself or his grandfather was a convert. In other words, he was either the son or the Rebbi Akiva was either the son or the grandson of a convert. And the Talmud tells us that they descended from Sisera. Sisera was the evil general at the time of Yael, the time of Devorah and Barak, the evil general that fought with the Jewish people and was conquered initially by Barak, and then later was killed by Yael. But the Talmud tells us that Rebbi Akiva is actually a descendant of his. There's a number of converts that descend from famous non-Jews, and one of them is Rebbi Akiva. Now, it's interesting that I actually wrote an article about this you can find on h.com or rabbilandis.com about the tremendous amount of converts at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. We know this because at the time of the destruction of the First Temple, there were only about 250,000 Jews left in the world, meaning the murder and unfortunately the cutting down of the Jewish people at the time of the destruction of the First Temple left only less than 500,000, probably around 250,000 Jews left in the world. And at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, roughly 500 years later, we see there are anywhere from 2 to 7 million Jews in the world. Now, censuses in antiquity are difficult and not so accurate, but the lowest number range is about 2 million. Higher number is at 7 million, and that's a huge population growth at that time, considering life expectancy and the different challenges of being alive at that time. So according to many historians, the only thing we can attribute that to is a tremendous increase in converts of the Jewish people at the time when Rome came supreme on the world, at the time when the temple and the Jewish experience in the land of Israel was coming to an end, and there's a lot of metaphysical ideas behind this, and this isn't really our topic for tonight. Again, you can see the article where I delve into it, but we know that paganism was bankrupt in the world at this time, and this is also probably why eventually lahavdil Christianity was adopted so easily within the Roman world, because they were looking for monotheism. And even though it's to question how monotheistic Christianity is, it's definitely more monotheistic than Roman paganism. And but it doesn't come with circumcision, Shabbos, kashrus, and all the trappings of being a Jew. So it was like viewed by the Roman Empire as an easier version of Judaism in many ways. Now we see the manifestation of that for us was that you did have, before the rise of Christianity, you had tremendous amounts of converts towards the end of the Second Temple time period, after the destruction of the Second Temple, and many of the famous converts. We talk about Onkelos, the one who wrote the Aramaic translation of the Torah, himself was a convert, and a nephew of Titus, of the emperor, the one who destroyed the Second Temple, the eventual emperor of Rome. And so you have many famous converts coming from out of the Roman Empire. So Rebbi Akiva was on that long list. At least his father or his grandfather was on that list, and that's really the humble beginnings Rebbi Akiva comes from. He does not come from any pedigree whatsoever. In fact, he comes from the opposite, as we said, because he descends from Sisera, and he goes from that to we'll see where he begins. Now, not only does he not come from pedigree or any type of aristocracy at all, but he himself really starts off seemingly at a disadvantage. He is not educated as a young man. He's not educated as a middle-aged man. We're taught that his Jewish education doesn't even begin until he is about 40 years old. Now, according to the Talmud, he lives well into his hundreds, possibly until 120. But the first third of his life, he not only was not a scholar, he did not know Aleph Beis, our sages tell us, and not only that, Rebbi Akiva later recounts the story about when he was an ignoramus, he hated the scholars so much so that he wanted to bite them like a donkey, meaning a bone-crushing bite. That's how much he hated them, because he thought the scholars looked down on ignoramuses like himself in a disparaging way. So that's the humble beginnings. Either the son or grandson of a convert, raises without any Jewish education whatsoever, and that's his beginning. But not only that, but in this first time period, this beginning 40 years of his life, we see a lot of the tragic story of Rebbi Akiva begin. We know that he was married at this time. We do not know the name of his first wife, to the best of my knowledge, and he became a young widower. His wife passed away and left him with children, left him as really a poor shepherd with children, and that's the situation Rebbi comes into in his 40s when he becomes the shepherd of one of the wealthiest men in Israel by the name of Ben Kalba Savua. Now, while Akiva ben Yosef, this young widower, or not so young widower at this point, is a shepherd for Ben Kalba Savua. We assume this story probably took place when he was around sometime in his 30s. Well, Ben Kalba Savua's daughter, Rachel, saw something special. She's one of the great women in Jewish history. She saw something special in Akiva. She saw that even though this shepherd, widower shepherd, was in complete ignoramus, she could tell from his mitos, from his character traits, from the way that he acted, that he was a very special person. And if you could only take someone like this Akiva ben Yosef and get him to learn Torah, the mix of his specialness with the learning of Torah would be something phenomenal. So Rachel not only took a liking to him, but fell in love with him, and essentially said, Akiva, I will marry you on condition that you start to learn Torah. Now, initially, Akiva was like, I'm almost, let's say I'm in my mid to late 30s at this point. I'm not going to start, I'm long since my prime. I'm not going to start learning Torah. But one day he experiences something. Well, he's out with the flock, and he sees a rock that was penetrated by a drip of water, by a small stream of water that was dripping down onto it, and that stream of water had penetrated a hole through this rock. And you've seen such things if you observe nature. We know that as Life's Little Instruction book once said, that in the confrontation between water and the rock, the water will always win, not through strength, but through perseverance. And that's essentially what Rebbi Akiva says. He says that if water, which is soft, can break through a rock which is hard, then Torah, which is compared to water, can surely break through the hardness of my heart. And essentially realizing that same idea, that in the confrontation between the rock and the water will always win, not through strength, but through perseverance. And that's really the story of Rebbi Akiva, because he is going to win the battle of his life, so to speak, not through early strength, but through just sheer perseverance. And he goes back and he finally accepts, he proposes to Rachel that they should get married, and that he'll go start studying Torah. Now, when Ben Kalba Savua finds out about this, you have this wealthy, one of the most wealthiest Jews in Israel at the time, and his daughter is going to be married off to not only a man significantly older than her, not only a widower with children, but not only a poor shepherd, but an ignoramus. And he's just like, absolutely not. He puts his foot down. He says, there's no way my daughter's marrying this guy. And Rachel, in the great defiant way of many great Jewish women, says, Tata, I'm sorry, I'm marrying him. At which point Ben Kalba Savua disowns his daughter. He disowns, he vows, takes a vow not to have anything to do with her or with Akiva ben Yosef. And that's where the marriage of Rachel and Akiva opens up. Part of that also is because of the vow. Akiva lost his job as the shepherd to Ben Kalbasavu, which was probably a halfway decent job, and he becomes a woodcutter. And the Talmud tells us that they are so poor that they couldn't afford blankets or mattresses, that they slept on straw beds without any kind of bedding. And in the morning, Akiva would spend the early part of the morning picking the straw out of Rachel's hair, because Rachel, we're told, had absolutely beautiful hair. And again, you imagine the situation. Akiva, okay, we know he came from humble beginnings, but Rachel, who came from the lap of luxury, subjects herself to this because she saw something very special in Akiva. So Akiva has to figure out where to start, and he has his young son from his first marriage, and he says, basically, son, I'm going to start with you. And he essentially, goes to cheder with his son, or his son goes to cheder and comes back and teaches his father. And, you can almost see the situation where you have the teacher trying to teach Aleph Beis to the students, and she's sitting there with a group of 5 or 6 year olds and says, okay, Moshe, it's your turn. Aleph Beis, Aleph, Aleph, Aleph Beis, Ba, Aleph Gimel Ga. And, okay, great. Okay, Shlomi, it's your turn. Kametz Aleph, Kametz Beis, Ba, Kametz Gimel Ga. Beautiful. Okay, Akiva, it's your turn. Kametz Aleph, Kametz Beis Ba, Kametz Gimel Ga, right? You can almost see the situation, but that's what it was. You had this now 40-year-old man who was learning Torah with his 5-year-old son, and or learning the Aleph Beis, and that's where he begins. But in the course of 12 years, he ends up, advances obviously past Aleph Beis, starts learning Chumash, Gemara, Mishnah, and ends up showing great promise in his studies. Eventually, Rachel says, Akiva, you know what? It's time for you to go to the next level. And she sends him off to the great academy of Rebbi Elazar and Rebbi Yeshua. And she on her own, she's left with, it was one thing when they were in poverty with his wood chopper's income. Now she's just on her own to raise the family, both her stepchildren from the first marriage, the children she had now had with Akiva, and he goes off for 12 years to the great academy. And in those 12 years, he goes from the little bit he had gained, learning with his son and at home, to becoming one of the greatest scholars in the Jewish people. And in those 12 years, he not only was a student of people like Rebbi Elazar and Rebbi Yeshua, but he became their colleague. And he had his own students. And he puts together a cohort of 12,000 of his own students. And after those 12 years, he comes back to reunite with his wife and his family. And as they're coming up to the house, and you can imagine the scene, he's coming up with these 12,000 students, and he wants to surprise Rachel, it seems, as our sages describe it. So he's like, shh, everyone be quiet. And he hears from outside the house one of the neighborhood women who was seemingly chastising Rachel, saying your husband, he's such a lazy bum. You send him off to yeshiva and he leaves you here in abject poverty. And what's up with you guys? And Rachel says, you know what? You got it all wrong. In fact, if he was standing here right now, I would send him away for another 12 years. At which point Akiva says, okay guys, let's go back. And he goes back to the yeshiva for another 12 years, making a total of 24 years. He's roughly 64 years old when he comes back. He's got 24,000 students at this time. And by this point, Rachel's also aged somewhat, and is, also with the situation of having a very hard life. And the rumor goes out, or the word goes out, that this great rabbi with his 24,000 students are coming to visit the town, and the whole town comes out with much pomp and circumstance, singing to the great Rebbi Akiva and his students. And sure enough, Rachel comes out to greet her husband, and with 24,000 students surrounding him, she can't get anywhere close. She looks like an old street beggar. And from a distance, Rebbi Akiva sees his wife and recognizes her trying to get through, and he stops the students and says, let my wife come up, because everything that is mine and everything that is yours is really hers. Because we know that Rachel was, so to speak, responsible for creating Rebbi Akiva. As they always say, behind every great man, there's a great woman shaking her head. The husband might be the head of the household, but the woman is the neck, and the neck can turn the head any way it wants to. And that's for sure the situation we see with Rebbi Akiva and with his wife, his second wife, Rachel. And that's the credit that Rebbi Akiva gives to Rachel. So Rachel comes through, they reunite, and eventually Ben Kalbasavu hears that there's this great rabbi who came to town, having no clue that this is his son-in-law. And at this point, 24 years after the vow that he made, to have nothing to do with his daughter or his son-in-law, he feels very bad about it. So he comes to see this great rabbi, again, not knowing he has any connection to this great rabbi, and he asks for a vow annulment, for a Taras Nedarim. And he says the situation, my daughter married this ignoramus shepherd who used to work for me, who was a widower with children, and I was against the whole thing, so I took a vow to have nothing to do with them, and I really, really regret it, Rabbi. Can you annul my vow? And Rebbi Akiva says to him, let's say you had known at the time that man would go on to become a great man. Would you have made the vow? And Ben Kalbasova responds, if I had known that he could even learn one chapter of Mishnah, or even one halacha, I would have never made the vow. At which point Rebbi Akiva says, Tata, it's me! And Ben Kalbasova is shocked at the situation, bends down, kisses his feet, and gives half of his estate to Rebbi Akiva. At which point Rebbi Akiva obviously becomes a tremendously wealthy man. Now, by the way, he never took tuition from any of these students. So that's one of the reasons why Rachel was still living in poverty, he was still living in poverty, but now their fortunes changed tremendously and he becomes one of the wealthiest men in Israel. Now, after the destruction of the Second Temple, we're told that Rebbi Akiva goes not to Yavna, where the
was detected at your front door.
Now, after the destruction of the Second Temple, we're told that Rebbi Akiva goes not to Yavna, where Yochanan ben Zakkai went, like we discussed last time, but he builds a nearby yeshiva in Bnei Brak. Bnei Brak's not so far from Yavna, and he builds a great yeshiva there. This is actually referenced in the Haggadah. We talk about, we'll read the Haggadah in just over 5 weeks, around 5 weeks at the Pesach Seder, and we'll talk about Rebbi Akiva sitting with the students in Bnei Brak. Well, that's what this is talking about after the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple, it was a very difficult situation for whatever was left of the Jewish community in Israel. Again, we mentioned that we have these little pockets, the one that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai built in Yavna, we have Rebbi Akiva in Bnei Brak, but it was very difficult because, we had Vespasian, who was emperor at the time of the destruction. His son Titus was the one who destroyed the temple, wasn't much better. Then we had Domitian, who was also a terrible anti-Semite. And, it was a long time before the Jews got any reprieve whatsoever at the hand of the Roman persecution. Now, that all changed somewhere around 117 of the Common Era, when an emperor by the name of Hadrian comes to power. And it seemed that he had at least initially had a more benevolent policy towards the Jews, and he had even promised to let the Jews rebuild the temple in Eretz Yisrael. And so, things were looking very up at this time for the Jewish people. But unfortunately, the Hellenists within the Roman Empire didn't like this, and they didn't like the rekindled Jewish presence in the land of Israel, and they wanted, because the Jewish presence and Judaism in general is antithetical to Greek culture, and therefore they wanted the Greek culture that had really permeated throughout Rome to permeate throughout the Roman Empire. And Israel is part of the Roman Empire, so Hadrian himself was quite a Hellenist and very into the Greek culture. So the Hellenists really persuaded him to change his have an about face, so to speak, to change his tone with the Jewish people, and unfortunately, the relationship between the Jewish people and Hadrian started to deteriorate, and eventually Hadrian put in place several harsh decrees on the Jews left in Israel to try and force them to assimilate. He banned the observance of Shabbos, he banned Bris Milah, he banned the recitation of Shema, and eventually in 129 before the Common Era, he founds a colony in Jerusalem, which he names Alea Capitolina, which means basically the city to Jupiter. So he changed the name of Jerusalem basically from Jerusalem to the Jupiter city, and he built a temple to Jupiter on the ruins of the Temple Mount. So at this point, with all the decrees, with all the, with everything, it was a lot, but really just de-Judaizing or making Jerusalem Judenrein, so to speak, was just too much for the Jewish people. And there was a force within the Jewish people, a force of rebellion that started to arise that was led by a man by the name of Shimon Bar Kokhba. And he led the resistance movement against the Romans, against Hadrian, and initially the revolt is successful. It seems that it seems that the Romans were pushed out Jerusalem, that the Roman governor at the time, his name was Turnus Rufus, and the Roman 10th Legion, which was in Israel, was banished from outside of Jerusalem. And for 2.5 years, it seems that there was actually sovereignty, Jewish sovereignty, back in the capital city. Now, there's all kinds of speculations that possibly Bar Kokhba started to rebuild the temple, but there's no real evidence either in our sages or archaeological to support that. It's possible that they at least built an altar and started to bring offerings, but it didn't necessarily go past that. Now, unfortunately, this success was short-lived. Now, I should mention that Rebbi Akiva was a full supporter of Bar Kokhba. In fact, Rebbi Akiva himself said that he believed that Bar Kokhba was Melech HaMashiach, was the King Messiah. Now, what's the concept of Messiah? Messiah is the king that we're told will bring the Jewish people back to Israel, will rebuild the temple, will throw off our captors, and that's exactly what Bar Kokhba was doing. So Rebbi Akiva thought that he was Melech HaMashiach, that he was the Mashiach. Now, there are many other members of the Sanhedrin who did not agree with Rebbi Akiva, but at least initially, in the initial success of this rebellion, Rebbi Akiva thinks he's the one. But unfortunately, the success of Bar Kokhba starts to go to his head, and it becomes clear that he is not the one that our sages have talked about, who will be Mashiach, and even Rebbi Akiva realizes this, and after this point, unfortunately, also the success of the rebellion deteriorates, and the Romans get the upper hand, and eventually the Romans will take back over Israel, take back over Jerusalem, and lead a true slaughter of the Jewish people that will commence on Tisha B'Av of that year, roughly the year 129, 130 of the Common Era, and it'll be one of the tragedies that we mourn on Tisha B'Av. And that was the aftermath of Bar Kokhba that, again, Rebbi Akiva lives through. And we're told in the Gemara that during this time period, all of the 24,000 students of Rebbi Akiva perished. Now, the Talmud gives us a couple of different approaches. One says that they weren't noe kavod zebazeh, they didn't honor each other properly, and that's probably the metaphysical reason. One says that they got some sort of plague, but the Ravid comes in and says, just quite simply, they were part of this mass slaughter of the Jewish people at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, at the time of the rebellion, and they were killed by the Romans. But be it as it may, we see that at this time, not only is the last flare of hope of the Jewish people in Israel stomped out during Rebbi Akiva's life, he loses all his students. There's, according to the Talmud, upwards of a million people are killed. Actually, Deo Cassius is one of the main sources we have for this, the Roman historian. And again, we have Rebbi Akiva, like when all the cards are down, when everything's stacked against him. And by the way, no one would have faulted Rebbi Akiva if at any point he would just retired. He's somewhere around, I don't know, close to 100 years old at this point, or over 100 years old at this point. And he could say, I lived a long life. I spread a lot of Torah knowledge. I did a lot of good things. Okay, I'm going to retire. I'm going to just take off my last few years. But no, Rebbi Akiva doesn't stop. In the aftermath of all this, first of all, he, with the loss of all his students, he says, okay, if I lost all those students, I'm going to continue to rebuild. And he goes from, the immense numbers of 24,000 students to say, I'm going to rebuild. And you know what? I'll rebuild with 5 students. And he has 5 students, the Talmud tells us: Rebbi Meir, Rebbi Yeshua, Rebbi Yossi, Reb Shimon, who's probably Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, and Rebbi Elazar ben Shemua. And because of that, the Talmud refers to him as the father of the world. Because everything that we know is Torah She'Ba'al Peh, as the oral tradition, both the Talmud and the Midrashim, the halachic Midrashim, everything is really attributed to Rebbi Akiva. Now, how do we know this? We know we're going to eventually talk about Reb Meir next time we get together. And Reb Meir is the backbone of the Mishnah. We have the concept of Stam Mishnah Reb Meir, but really we attribute, even though Rabbi Yehuda Natsi was the one who redacted the Mishnah, the words of the Mishnah, for the most part, the words of Reb Meir. He was one of Rebbi Akiva's main students. The Tosefta, the other Braisos that we study in the Talmud quite often. Rabbi Nehemiah, one of Rebbi Akiva's main students. The Sifra, one of the main Midrashim. Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Yehuda, one of his main students. The Sifri, another one of the main Midrashim. Rabbi Shimon, another one of his main students. And again, if that's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we also have the Zohar, the main work of Kabbalah. So we see that really the whole, spectrum of Jewish academia that becomes what we now know as the Torah She'Ba'al Peh, it was all recorded and redacted by initially the first generation students of Rebbi Akiva and then the subsequent students of those. So because of that, the Talmud says Rebbi Akiva is really the father of the world, because everything that really was able to take us as a people and aid us to survive in exile is because we organized the Torah Shebaal Peh. We eventually wrote down the oral tradition, and that was all done by the direction of Rebbi Akiva, by his students, and mainly when he was after 100 years old, already had lost by this point 2 wives, by the way, because Rachel had passed away at this point too. He lost some of his children. He had lost 24,000 students, and after all that, he rebuilds to be able to to really make it that because of that we live on today. And don't think that this time period after the Bar Kokhba revolt was a walk in the park, because after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Romans at that point systematically wanted to destroy the entire Jewish presence in Israel. They make Torah study and teaching of Torah illegal. They kill tens of thousands of rabbis, including the 10 martyrs that we mentioned on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, and amongst those is actually Rebbi Akiva. Rebbi Akiva will be martyred at this time when he's somewhere over 100 years old. And not only that, but this is the time period where the name of Israel is called Judah at that time, was changed to Philistia, Palestine. All right, if you ever wonder where the name Palestine comes from, it was an attempt to make Israel completely Judenrein. So when we hear the name Palestine, know that name was put on the country to say this is not a Jewish country anymore. Right? That was the goal of the name from the beginning. I mean, that's why the Palestinians of today took the name, because they have no ethnic connection to the Philistines of old. But anyways, that all happened in these last few years of Rebbi Akiva. And eventually Rebbi Akiva is arrested, and he is sentenced to death for teaching Torah, for trying to make the Jewish people live on. Now, luckily, his 5 students survived without him, but Rebbi Akiva is sentenced to death. And on Erev Yom Kippur, in the town of Caesarea on the west coast of Israel, and that hippodrome over there, if you've ever been there, Rebbi Akiva was sentenced to a gruesome death in which the skin would be raked off his body until he would die. And he's brought out first thing in the morning to be put to death. And as the Romans are literally raking the skin off his body, he's saying the Shema. And his students say to him, like, Rebbe, Ad Khan? Like Rebbe, we get it. You're the ultimate optimist. You're the ultimate one who believes the Jewish people always get up. You're the ultimate one who fights on. But they're breaking your skin off. Still you have such a strong faith in Hashem? To which Rebbi Akiva responds, all my life I was bothered by the words of the Shema, where we say, V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, love Hashem your God, b'chol levavcha, u'v'chol nafshecha, u'v'chol me'odecha, which means with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your possessions. He said, I was pretty sure I loved Hashem with all my heart and all my possessions, but I never had any proof that I really loved Hashem with all my soul. And now that I have the chance to prove it, I'm going to miss that opportunity? Absolutely not. And he says the word Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And with that last word Echad going out of his mouth, the Romans take his life, and the soul ascends to heaven. And that soul really represents everything that it means to be a Jew. The ultimate optimism, always looking up. There's a story in the end of Tractate Makos that tells us that Rebbi Akiva, after the destruction of the temple, was walking around Jerusalem, and the destroyed Temple Mount could be seen. And the rabbis that he was walking with were crying. And Rebbi Akiva started laughing. And the rabbis asked Akiva, why are you laughing? He said, why are you crying? And he said, what do you mean, why are we crying? Look at the temple. There's jackals coming out of the Holy of Holies. And he said, you know what? That's why I'm laughing. Because our sages prophesied that if the Jewish people didn't behave, that one day Yerushalayim would be laid in ruin. But they also prophesied that after that ruin, there would one day be a resurgence of Jerusalem with children dancing in the streets and great happiness with the rebuilding of the temple. And I thought until this point that maybe that prophecy was just hyperbole. But now that we see that the negative has happened, we can anticipate the positive happening. To which the other rabbis responded, Akiva ben Yosef, you have comforted us. He was the epitome of humility to the end of his life, being referred to in the Gemara of Akiva ben Yosef, never forgetting his humble beginnings, no matter how big of a scholar he became, no matter how wealthy he became. And that's how Rebbi Akiva is remembered. And seeing as he was martyred on Erev Yom Kippur, on the day before Yom Kippur, we actually remember him as we go into the Yom Kippur service to set that tone of the most solemn day of the year. There's a custom that right before Kol Nidre, we recite the verse, Or Zerul Tzadik U'Yishrei Leiv Simcha. And the reason we recite that verse is because if you look at the last letters of each of the words of that verse, they are Resh, Ayin, Kuf, Yud, Beis, Hey, which spells out Rebbi Akiva. And as if to say that we want to remember Rebbi Akiva essentially on his yard site, and really he should be a Melitz Yosher, he should be an advocate for us in heaven. Because Rebbi Akiva really, in truth, represents everything that it is to be a Jew. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I look forward to being with you again in 2 weeks, because I'll be at the bris, God willing, or on my way back from the bris next week at this time. And I look forward to continuing with you when in 2 weeks' time we discuss the life and times of Rebbi Meir. Everybody have a wonderful week, a wonderful Shabbos, a Freilich and Purim, and I look forward to being with you next time. Thank you.